All right, good evening. My name is Dr. John Riley, and this is episode 2 of the Civil War on Paper, in which we are reading a local newspaper, the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector, and analyzing some of the articles. This week we have some humorous news. There is analysis of the federal defeat at Bull's Run, as well as a look at corruption in the Lincoln administration. So without further ado, let us dive in. So this is for August 1st, 1861. I'm off by a day, and I apologize for that. Had some technical difficulties yesterday, but here we are. And we open with, this is a page 1 story, a captain sold. Now, sold in this case is using a much older definition. It's one that we don't really use all that much anymore, but meaning to trick or deceive. So if you were to sell someone, it would mean that you had tricked them. So here we go, a captain sold. A gallant volunteer officer was badly sold in Baltimore a few days since. He was searching the homes of citizens for arms with a squad of men. On arriving at the residence of an odd gentleman named Hayes, he was met in the hall by his daughter, a beautiful black-eyed girl of 18, who appeared deeply agitated and implored the captain not to search the house. The officer was sternly immovable, resolved to do his duty, and the more bent upon searching from the apparent dismay of the fair girl. "Indeed, indeed," she exclaimed, "we have only 3 guns in the house." The captain smiled incredulously. "Fetch them to me," said he, remembering the fate of poor Ellsworth. And I'll circle back to him in a moment. The young lady hurried upstairs and returned with an old, rusty, double-barreled shotgun that no prudent man would have ventured to load and discharge. "The others! The other 2!" demanded the officer. "Oh, sir, my brothers, sobbed the girl. "I cannot take them from them." The captain pushed her aside. "Forward, men!" he shouted, falling into the rear himself. As the file of soldiers hastily mounted the stairs, the young lady clung to the skirts of the officer, who was the last to ascend, exclaiming wildly, But, sir, my brothers, you will not harm my brothers." The captain shook her off, somewhat ungallantly, and rushed up after the soldiers, who had by this time reached the closed door of a chamber. After a pause, the men pushed open the door, rushed in with bayonets fixed, when 2 juvenile zouaves of the ages of 8 and 10 years, fully armed and equipped with wooden guns, appeared drawn up in a line before them. At the same moment, the silvery laugh of the black-eyed beauty was heard on the stairs, echoed by a couple of chambermaids who were peering over the banisters from above. The officer beat a hasty retreat without making a seizure of the 2 remaining guns. So a little bit of a humorous story there, but it refers to a rather serious incident that happens early in the war, and that is the death of Colonel Ellsworth. So Elmer Ellsworth. I called him Colonel Ellsworth. We'll fix that there. Colonel Ellsworth. He was colonel of the 11th New York Zouave Infantry, known as the 1st Fire Zouaves, which was a regiment raised in New York City. Born in Malta, New York, Ellsworth studied military tactics and law and was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln, having clerked in Lincoln's law office in Illinois. When Lincoln issued his executive order requesting 75,000 soldiers to defend the capital and subdue the rebellion, Ellsworth went to New York City and managed to raise 1,100 men. Returning to D.C. with the newly formed 11th New York, outfitted in the Algerian fashion with open jackets and baggy pants known as surals, Ellsworth set about training his raw recruits. Perhaps most famously, the men of the 11th New York helped to extinguish a fire at the Willard Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, tapping into their experience as firemen in New York City. When Virginia voted to secede on May 23rd, the regiment took part in the occupation of Arlington Heights and Alexandria, which lays directly across the Potomac from D.C. It was in Alexandria that Ellsworth would become the first U.S. officer killed during the rebellion. A large Confederate flag had been flying for weeks from the Marshall House Inn. It was so large that you could actually see it from the White House. And it had been flaunting, basically in open defiance, the proprietors' contempt for the Lincoln administration. Colonel Ellsworth and 4 men went into the hotel to take down the flag. But upon coming back down the stairs, Ellsworth was ambushed by James Jackson, the hotel owner, and a secessionist fire eater. Jackson jumped out of hiding and shot Ellsworth in the chest with a shotgun. One of the enlisted men with him, Francis Brownell of Troy, New York, shot and then bayoneted Jackson to death, an action for which he would later receive the Medal of Honor. After a pretty intense petitioning campaign, he tried for years to get this act awarded a medal. And it wasn't until his congressman got involved that Congress finally granted him one. But yes, Francis Brownell awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for killing the man that killed Colonel Ellsworth. Ellsworth's body laid in state in the White House per Lincoln's request, and the Northern public was both outraged and saddened by the death of this popular flamboyant officer. Remember Ellsworth became a rallying cry. And there were actually a couple units that embraced his name as their own personal moniker. They became known as Ellsworth's Avengers. Now, curiously, the Sons of Confederate Veterans had a plaque created to celebrate Jackson's role in the killing of a United States soldier. And it was placed at a location near where the Marshall House Inn was, and it was there as recently as 2017. So you had a plaque for a private citizen who shot and killed a U.S. soldier, and it was on display. And not as in like, oh, this happened. It was like, oh, this was celebratory. It was only taken down because the property was purchased by an international company and basically decided, that's maybe a bad look, we'll get rid of it. But it was there until 2017, this plaque celebrating the death of this U.S. soldier. So when the officer is going up the stairs remembering the fate of Ellsworth, that's what this is referring to. This happens in May of 61, a full month before the Battle of Bull Run. And speaking of which, we turn to other news here. A scene in Congress. The scene presented by the Senate and House of Representatives on the reception of the intelligence of the defeat of our troops at Bull Run was indescribable. The gloom hung like a pall over both houses, and no one seemed to have the heart to transact the public business. No one seemed to feel this more intensely than Mr. Crittenden of Kentucky. When he rose on Monday morning, he asked, well, what further news? He had gone to bed under the delusion that the Federal Army had triumphed. We are routed, utterly routed, was the reply to his question. The old man stared back in astonishment, and when the facts were brought before him, he went back, sat down, and putting his head upon his hands, burst into tears. There is no longer room for doubt on which side Mr. Crittenden's feelings are enlisted. And so, I must say, look, what we're talking about here with Crittenden is the fact that he was responsible for a last-minute peace effort to keep the country together, as we talked about last week, the Crittenden Compromise, something that was designed to roll back the clock to the Compromise of 1820 and basically to give Southern secessionists everything they wanted in order to keep them from seceding. It didn't work. None of the Southern politicians seriously considered his proposals, and Northerners also hated it because it included an unamendable amendment that would have enshrined slavery in the Constitution forever. The whole point of the Constitution is that it is amendable and changeable. And because he had sponsored this, there were some whispers and rumors, right? Is he a secret Southern sympathizer? Is he not a true Northerner? Is he not a true Lincoln man? I mean, he's from Kentucky. He operates, he exists in this precarious space on the border. And so what they're talking about here is upon seeing his distress at the fact that the U.S. Army loses, right? We no longer have any doubts of him. He is definitely for the preservation of the Union. So first Bull Run, what happens? Well, this one's a tough one for the United States. So July 21st, 1861 is the first Battle of Bull Run. Now remember, the last issue we talked about was 2 weeks ago, because the July 25th issue, which apparently there was one, it was not preserved by the archive that I have access to. There are some local archives that seem to have it, but it's actually quite difficult right now to get into some of these places per COVID guidelines and also just timing. Local historical societies don't always have the funding to be open at convenient times. And so rather than chase it down, I let that one go, and we're pressing forward with what we have. But some of the pitfalls of digitization, it's not always preserved the way we would like. So that issue came out right before this battle, and now they've had a little bit of time to reflect on it. It's July 21st, 1861. It's the first major engagement of the war. It involves tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides, far larger than any previous engagement fought on American soil. And it very quickly dispels the notion, for the first time, that this war would be quick and would be without blood, which was something that both sides had been kind of hoping for or expecting. General Scott in the War Department had been drawing up plans to defeat the Confederacy rather bloodlessly. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. In the South, you have a couple famous examples. You had the editor of the Charleston Mercury who vowed to eat the bodies of all the dead. And then you had Senator James Chestnut Jr., who claimed that he would drink up all the blood spilled, which surely would barely fill a lady's thimble. They're both wildly wrong. So the battle came about due to political pressure on the Lincoln administration to deliver a victory against the rebels. Military commanders had cautioned that the newly formed Army of Volunteers was not yet ready, which is where we get the very famous Lincoln quote that, "Yes, you are green, but they are green also. You are both green together." Nevertheless, mid-July, the newly created Army of Northeastern Virginia, under command of Regular Army Officer Major Irwin McDowell, who is now jumped several stages. He completely bypasses Colonel and goes straight on to General, broke camp in Alexandria and set out for Manassas, which is an important rail junction that links the Shenandoah Valley with the trade ports and major cities of Eastern Virginia. The march was painfully slow. Civilians turned soldier were pretty unaccustomed to the boredom of camp life, but also the pace of army life. And on the march, they would just kind of wander off. If the column wasn't moving, they would get bored. And there's all these accounts of, officers turning around and something like a third of the regiment would just be gone. They'd go off and pick berries. They'd take naps under trees. They'd go fill their canteens. It's complete amateurs to arms. Halts and delays at the head of the column would create a ripple effect, which caused the Army of the Potomac to at times stretch and contract like an accordion. It gave the Confederates all the time they needed to prepare their defenses. Compared to the pace that U.S. armies would set later in the war, by the time you get to, say, 63 and 64, when you've got proper veterans marching around, they're covering about a third of the distance. They're setting about a third of the pace of professional soldiers. It's a catastrophe, logistically and operationally. And the Confederates see it coming. They've got spies in D.C. who are passing information. They've got sympathetic civilians who are sending word. People are felling trees across roadways or knocking down bridges. So the rebels know it's coming, and they have time to prepare. Now, stationed at Manassas Junction was the Army of the Potomac, which is such a fun little thing because that is very much the name that used for the major U.S. Army. But the actual army itself was called the Army of the Potomac, and that was General Beauregard's army. It doesn't become the Army of Northern Virginia until Robert E. Lee will take over in mid-1862. And even then, there's not a lot of serious debate, but there's some debate that the Army never officially stopped being called the Army of the Potomac because Lee was in charge of the Department of Northern Virginia. And we're splitting some hairs here, but nevertheless, we have a little bit of fun sort of wordplay. It's the Army of Northeastern Virginia, that's the U.S. Army here, the Army of the Potomac, which is the Confederate force. PGT Beauregard's men are outnumbered by McDowell. McDowell's got about 35,000. Beauregard just a little over 20,000. So it's about a 50% increase over Beauregard. But the very thing that made Manassas a strategic target would now come to bear in the defenders' favor. It's a railroad hub. Telegraphs arrive in the Shenandoah Valley, where Joseph Johnston is stationed with another 12,000 men, his 4 brigades that make up the aptly named Army of the Shenandoah, who quickly march up the valley to Strasburg and begin crossing the mountains via railroad to the relief of Beauregard. Now, opposing Johnston had been a Union army, also called the Army of the Shenandoah, under the command of Robert Patterson. Patterson was at Harper's Ferry with 18,000 men. And he's a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He's given a command for a reason, because he's one of the few high-ranking officers in the U.S. Army who seems to know what he's doing. And he's told to keep pressure on Johnston in order to pin him in place. Because with McDowell pushing on Manassas, what you don't want is Johnston and Beauregard coming together to create perhaps a local army that's capable of withstanding McDowell. Patterson just completely drops the ball. And the rebel cavalry in the valley does such a good job screening Johnston's movements that a full hour after Johnston withdraws from Winchester, Patterson sends off a telegram to D.C. It is basically like, I have successfully pinned him at Winchester. McDowell's clear to go. There will be no reinforcements from the valley. He's already gone. He's on his way. He's left. If you don't know who Robert Patterson is, there's a good reason for that. His failure to keep Johnston in the valley causes him to take a lot of the blame for the fiasco that unfolds. And he's pretty quietly retired from the army afterwards. But anyway, back to Bull Run. This is a mess. Neither army has a really well-organized command structure. It's largely individual brigade commanders making decisions in the moment, and a number of these brigade commanders are quite good. They're military men with experience. They're veterans of the Mexican-American War, and a number of them would later go on to hold significant commands of their own. People like, knocked my tea over, people like Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, people on the U.S. side like Sherman, Oliver Howard. These men are brigade commanders. They'll go on to command armies throughout the course of the war. But realistically, both armies lack proper hierarchies of command. I know on paper the order of battle for McDowell's army lists 5 divisions, but realistically, it's independent brigade commanders with an overall army leader on top. And holy cow, did it show. Both armies attempt the same maneuver, a right hook designed to turn the enemy's flank, and amazingly for the U.S., it almost succeeds. Despite the inexperience of the rank-and-file soldiers and the lack of coordination among brigade commanders, some 10,000 U.S. soldiers successfully push back about 4,500 rebel defenders. They get a start very early in the morning. They're up about 2 a.m. They make this flanking march, and they successfully outmaneuver Beauregard, who expected McDowell to actually really direct the thrust of his attack towards the railroad junction itself. And that's where he's got the bulk of his men concentrated. But Beauregard's major effort is going around the side. Despite having better than 2-to-1 numbers, though, the attack takes a really long time, way too long. The individual brigade commanders who are pushing on the U.S. side can't seem to coordinate, and so they're not bringing the full advantage of their numbers to bear. The Confederates are often able to fight sort of a single brigade at a time, which largely nullifies your numerical advantage. Still, over time, the U.S. is pushing them back, despite a whole host of problems. Breaches in the line aren't being properly exploited, brigade commanders are advancing and withdrawing without talking to one another. The smoke and noise of battle is a very far cry from the parade grounds and the militia drills that a number of these men had been used to, and so individual soldiers are having a difficult time here. There's no clear agreement on what the uniforms look like for each side, and the flags look an awful lot alike. So you have many documented instances in which units fired on one another when they were on the same side, or crucially didn't fire on one another when they were on the opposing side. Still, the U.S. is gaining ground, and even with Johnston's reinforcements from the valley, the rebels are almost pushed off their positions. But a number of things come together to ruin the United States' chances. First, they're tired. The rebels had had plenty of time to rest and prepare for this attack, while the U.S. column, like I said, is up at 2 in the morning, and it marches and fights all day. McDowell will withhold critical reserve brigades that could have potentially made a difference had they been employed properly, whereas the Confederates throw all of their reserves into the lines whenever possible to try and plug gaps and to stem the U.S. attack. Critically, during the fighting, a pair of U.S. artillery batteries that had been causing some pretty serious damage to the rebel position are completely overrun after the 33rd Virginia Infantry, clad in dark blue uniforms, emerges from the woods. U.S. artillerymen thought that they were Federal soldiers that had come to help defend their new exposed position. These cannons were out on the extreme flank and had been putting a pretty bad fire into the rebel lines. And so when they see these men coming out, they're wearing blue uniforms. They're Virginia militiamen. And it's not till they close the gap and then open fire at close range that the artillerymen realize their mistake. The batteries are overrun, and this new position allows them to then outflank another force and to continue to begin to roll up the Federal line. A spirited defense by Thomas Jackson's Virginia Brigade, which had been part of Johnston's Valley Army, buys time for the rebels to coordinate a counterattack. And as the U.S. Army grows more and more tired, as precious artillery pieces are captured or straight up abandoned, the U.S. morale is starting to break. You have to remember, these are 90-day volunteers, right? That was what Lincoln could legally ask for at the start of the war. Fort Sumter is in April, so you've got these people, they're organized May, June, July. Their time is almost done. They're thinking about going home, right? They're days away from their enlistments ending. They're not here to die gloriously for the cause. They thought they were going to come down here and thwop the rebels, and they're not. And so they don't feel the need to stick around. And as the tide begins to turn, more and more of them start to just stream off the battlefield. Now, the retreat from Bull Run begins orderly enough. It's being carried out in good order. The U.S. forces are falling back. And then disaster. There's a wagon on one of the bridges that crosses Bull Run Creek. It becomes knocked over and disabled by an artillery shell. This blocks the bridge. And as a result, panic sets in. Soldiers start discarding weapons, cartridge boxes, anything they could get rid of to make themselves faster and lighter. They're swimming across the creek. They're just sprinting. They're running. McDowell, for his part, does manage to organize an effective rear guard that withdraws in good order and keeps the Confederates from overrunning the Federals as they retreat. But the day is done. The Army will utterly refuse to rally until it reaches D.C. The U.S. is completely routed, and the news stuns the North and brought elation to the South. With near 900 dead and 2,500 wounded, the nation was shocked at the bloodshed. Now, by later comparisons, Bull Run is not particularly bloody when you compare it to the loss of life at, say, Antietam or Gettysburg or the Wilderness Campaign. But this is the largest and costliest battle on North American soil to date. No single symbolic victory was going to resolve this contest, both sides now realize. Sure, the U.S. had lost, but they were hardly losing. And it would take years of treasure, blood, and death before this rebellion is suppressed. Now, there was another piece here. A woman for the Times. The Troy Times says an elderly lady who attended a meeting of the 1st Vermont Regiment just before they left for the seat of war certainly evinced the most patriotism of any we have yet heard of. As soon as the prominent speakers had finished their patriot speeches, the old lady rose. Let's see, where are we? Oh, this is weird. This is the wrong image. Let me pull up the correct one. I don't know why it was like that. I just want to make sure I'm not about to change something on a different page. Yep, totally would. Let's make that go away. New image. All right. Where is this piece? Heroic Sisters. I know it's on this page. A Woman of the Times. Here we go. Here's the piece on Mr. Crittenden, a scene in Congress. And here is the Woman of the Times. All right. How did I get the wrong page on there? That's so weird. Anyway, Woman for the Times. The old lady arose, full of enthusiasm, and said she thanked God that she was able to do something for her country. Her 2 sons, all she possessed in the world, were in the regiment, and the only thing she had to regret was that she could not have known it 20 years ago. She would have furnished more of them. And this is no doubt a humorous anecdote, but also something that will crop up a lot. Both sides will play up the importance of women during this fight, and they will recognize the role that women play over their households. And so you will have situations where the newspapers are basically publishing editorials telling families not to write gloomy letters. You know, don't demoralize your husbands or your brothers or your sons, right? Be upbeat. Really chip in for the cause. You can do this. You know, they're risking their lives. They need you to be supportive. They need you to be cheering them on. After the war is over, Southerners in particular will develop a particular myth around Southern women, that they were utterly devoted to the cause. They were completely selfless, right? We couldn't have done this without the Southern women. And as Drew Gilpin Faust sort of points out, that there's a lot of myth and not a lot of reality there. And in fact, what you have are people who perhaps start the war pretty gung-ho and very quickly go, holy cow, this is terrible. I want my husband back. I want my son back. My entire dissertation is filled with letters from families basically saying, you've done enough. Come home. I don't know how to do this without you. I don't know, and quite literally, I don't know how to manage this farm or this business without you. I've never had to before. Come home. I don't need you dead. I need someone to tend to the crops and to take care of the children. And so these little stories like this, they're good for morale. You know, they feel nice in here. This is 1861. Give it a few years, and these kinds of stories start to change. But I did like seeing this. This was interesting to find in here. Now, speaking of Bull Run, the editor of the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector, Cyrus Thayer, hey, I got the right one this time, had some things to say in his regular column. Here, on to Richmond Cry and the result, he lays the blame for the defeat at Bull Run on newspapermen and corrupt officials who had forced the army into action before it was ready. And this is good. So here we go. He writes, just now there is considerable clashing between the responsible persons of the administration and the rabid Republican press as to who was responsible for the late deplorable disaster to the federal army. Every day brings to light evidence of unpardonable inefficiency in the management of the affairs of the government. Peculation and private piques seem to be the governing motive of those entrusted with power. To put down rebellion and save the Union appears to be a secondary consideration, while there are fat contracts to be had or political favorites to reward. So this isn't just political opposition to Lincoln's admin from a local editor. The process of awarding government contracts to support the war was incredibly corrupt. So much so that by this time already, August of 1861, there were already congressional hearings on the matter. Part of the problem is that the U.S. is entirely unprepared to fight a war on this scale. So it had no real stockpiles of weapons and equipment that it could tap into, certainly not enough to field an army the size required to fight this war. Provided with a blank check, so to speak, Secretary of War Simon Cameron found the understaffed War Department completely unequal to the task of getting what they needed. So in order to procure weapons, uniforms, draft animals, food, you name it, he turns things over to state governors and private citizens. And the result was utter chaos combined with blanket theft. Did I say blanket? I meant blatant. Blatant theft. Blatant theft. Manufacturers were quick to try and cash in, offering cheaply made products for tremendous prices. And a classic example of this that actually changes American language came in the form of shoddy. Shoddy is a wool byproduct, typically considered to be the least desirable parts, and it was often used to make, if anything, really low quality products. Well, when the war broke out, some textile manufacturers started gluing uniforms together out of discarded shoddy. They're not properly stitched. It's not made out of reliable, properly woven wool. It's the garbage that you don't want when you make proper wool clothing. The first time these uniforms were worn in the rain, the glue came undone, and their uniforms are just quite literally melting off of them. They're just falling apart. As such, shoddy in English has come to be synonymous with substandard quality and poor workmanship. One case of just blatant embezzlement was in the form of a case of carbine rifles that the War Department had sold as obsolete. They're reacquired by the War Department from private contractors for about $15 each. They realize they're garbage, so they're sold off again for about $3.50, so a massive loss for the government, only to be rebundled and sold back to the War Department again for $22 a piece. This is just complete and utter waste, not to mention a massive misuse of public funds. The man responsible for funding that scheme, and boy, did it make a lot of money, none other than J.P. Morgan. That J.P. Morgan. So while Cameron himself, Secretary of War, did not use his office for personal gain, he's also clearly not up to the task. And Lincoln replaces him in early 62. And it's like, oh my gosh, like you're killing us. Like, I'm getting slammed in the press. The people who you are putting in charge suck. And our soldiers are walking around in uniforms that are melting in the rain. Enough. But as early as July of 61, people are complaining about the cheap quality of soldiers' equipment and the exorbitant prices that they're being charged for these things. So the House of Representatives creates the Select Committee on Government Contracts. This is headed initially by Charles Van Wyck of New York, and the committee would eventually call hundreds of witnesses and issued 3 reports totaling over 3,000 pages. In addition to the War Department's chaos, the committee uncovered that the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, had been awarding contracts to friends and political supporters rather than to the lowest bidder, as you were supposed to do. Vessels were being bought at above market rates that were completely unseaworthy. And again, part of this problem is that the Navy is wildly unprepared for this. The US Navy, like the Army in peacetime during the 19th century, is tiny, largely tasked with protecting US merchant marine shipping from the occasional pirate and guarding the coast. It's a few dozen vessels at best. Lincoln has called for a full blockade of all rebel ports. They don't have the ships for that. And so one of the things that Gideon Welles is tasked to do is to build a modern navy out of practically nothing. And one of the ways he does it is he just starts writing checks to anyone who comes forward and can promise him ships. But some of these can't even be used. I mean, there's vessels that are towed into harbor that the United States has bought, and the first thing you do is you go, I guess we're sinking it because there's no way we could possibly use this. It's an absolute mess, and it's plaguing the Army and the Navy. Cases of gunpowder are being turned out. They're full of sawdust. Boxes of supposedly preserved foods are full of maggots, or they're covered in thick layers of mold. Out west, it's even worse. The long arm of the government can't keep up with the malfeasance that's going on in the Western theater. And so you have men like Fremont or Major Justice McKinstry. They're using their positions as basically their own personal piggy banks, taking lucrative bribes in exchange for awarding government contracts. So when Thayer here is talking about corruption in the Lincoln administration, he's not just blowing smoke as a political opponent. It's going on. And thanks to Congress shining a light on it, everyone knows about it. So eventually Congress will pass the False Claims Act, designed to combat corruption in government contracts. Since the U.S. lacked pretty much any regulatory or enforcement agencies of any kind, the act actually relied on whistleblowers who would receive part of the recovered money as reward for calling attention to misuse of public funds. This was largely phased out in the 20th century in favor of more aggressive forms of regulation for the awarding of government contracts. But by at least one historian's estimation, this act saves the federal government something like $20 billion, billion with a B, over its lifetime in the form of recovered money, thanks to whistleblowers who point out when contracts were being awarded unjustly. It's not too bad. Thayer continues, everybody knows that the expense of an army when stationed at a given point is much less than when on the move, and hence the great clamor of the contractors and the press in their interest in getting up the cry of "On to Richmond." Members of Congress and cabinet members whose friends furnished the supply of the army joined in the echo, "On to Richmond," until the innocence of Lincoln and the weakness of Scott yielded to the outside pressure and the order was given. The order was obeyed, and the result is before the world. Thousands of lives have been sacrificed and millions of property destroyed to satisfy the imperative demand of "On to Richmond." Okay, wow. So he's not wrong about the widespread corruption. But to claim that Bull Run happened because contractors wanted to cash in on the army, just no. There was indeed a great cry from the public and the press. So long as the rebellion went unchallenged, it was successful. To let rebels operate just across the river from D.C. was unconscionable, and many wanted to see secessionists punished for their threat to representative government. Yes, there was political and press pressure to move, especially after Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the U.S. Army, a position he held, I believe, longer than anyone else in U.S. history, more than 20 years, by 1861. His plan to rebeat the rebellion was lambasted as slow, ponderous, inefficient. By the way, by the time the war breaks out, Scott is so obese he can't even climb on his own horse. There's no way this guy was going to be able to lead the army. This is a ceremonial title at best, which is why he largely steps down before the end of 61. A hero of the Mexican-American War, a man who has been a lifelong soldier, he does not have the stamina anymore to lead the U.S. Army at this time. And his plan to defeat the rebellion combined a coastal blockade with the seizure of the Mississippi River. He wanted an army to sail down the river and capture New Orleans, thereby cutting off one of the South's major ports and chopping up some of its territory so that Louisiana would effectively be cut in half. And everything east of that would be cut off from Texas, Arkansas, etc. Once this was accomplished, the U.S. would just sort of gradually squeeze the rebellious territory into submission. Detractors hated it. They called it the Anaconda Plan. They're like, this is slow, this is dumb, we need a quick victory. Ironically, it eventually forms the core of the model that is used to actually bring the rebellion to heel. General Grant leads a successful campaign down the Mississippi River. The U.S. Navy successfully sails up and does capture New Orleans, and a blockade of Confederate ports is effectively put into place that, although initially a mess and very easy to get around, by the end of the war is quite difficult to surpass and does a great job in cutting off foreign imports from getting to the Confederacy. But in 1861, nobody wants that. They want a clear victory. They want to march, go, defeat them. The rebel capital's right there at Richmond, 100 miles from D.C. Go and get it. Was there a great public pressure to move out of Richmond? Absolutely. Was it so that contractors could get rich? No, not to my knowledge. I think Thayer's a little off base here. But he does draw an important point. He is drawing attention to the fact that this process is rife with corruption. And it actually forms the basis for, in the North, after the war, people are obsessed with government corruption, something that nobody's really thinking about in the 19th century. Not really. I mean, they're paying a little bit of lip service to it, but also it was just sort of expected that, like, this was the way things got done. You wanted municipal services? Well, your local machine politics needed votes, and they expected to get money and things like that. But now, all of a sudden, after the war, people are going up. They're obsessed that someone is profiting from the public trust. And it really is quite fascinating. There's a fantastic book that came out about this. I think it was like 2012. But it begins with the Civil War, and the fact that soldiers are stepping off to war with shoes that fall apart, muskets that don't fire, or worse, backfire. Some of those the weapons in that Hall carbine scandal were known. They were more likely to take off the soldier's hand than they were to kill an enemy, because they had been improperly bored. They had been then widened to support a modern caliber musket ball, which meant that the walls of the firing chamber were so thin that when the black powder ignited, it was very likely to just breach. And you've got guys reporting lost thumbs, burns to their faces. It was a mess. And the government bought them twice. Disaster. Now, one last piece that I did find in this particular issue that I thought was just so fascinating, right here. A report that the reason, maybe report's too strong of a word, an editorial that the reason the army at Bull Run failed was that it contained too many Democrats. This is crazy to me. I've not seen this before. Republicans say that the army that advanced on Manassas was composed mostly of Democrats and Union men. Union not being the way we use the term today when we say the Union to mean like federal soldiers. Union here would have been more like the constitutional Unionists or the border men who had wanted to simply avoid a conflict by pretending there wasn't one. The Constitutional Union Party was such a fascinating blip on the radar. And basically its entire platform was like, don't secede, but also don't ever mention slavery again. And the United States will just get along. It's not really popular outside of like Tennessee and Kentucky. But so yes, too many Democrats and Union men, and that they did not mean to fight, but to run away and bring disgrace upon the administration. Hereafter, it is the intention to put none but Republicans on guard. Hope they won't. That one is new to me. I have never seen anything like that. And of course, it's utter nonsense. The notion that the army was somehow made up of all of these Democrats who were just planning on breaking and running in order to make the Lincoln administration look bad. The army would be composed of Republicans and Democrats from all over the North who go on to fight quite well. And but yeah, this one is new to me. I had yet to see an analysis of one of the armies losing because it just had too many Democrats, right, and not enough Republicans. That's just wild. 19th century newspapers are fantastic. There is also in here too, there was a piece in which Thayer threw a fit because in their July 18th issue, they had reported on a meeting at Malta in which some men had gotten together and were trying to hammer out a compromise to save the Union. Well, apparently a newspaper editor in Saratoga did not like that the Schenectady Democrat reported on this, and or perhaps didn't like the way in which the Schenectady Democrat reported on this, and ran a nasty article attacking them. And so Thayer wrote back in this paper about how he didn't realize that the editor of the Saratoga paper had been named like government censor of all news in the United States, and he thought he was still allowed to report on things. Like, I always chuckle when I hear well-meaning people say, oh, everything is too partisan nowadays. We need to return to, the good old days when Americans got along. Americans have never gotten along. They're as nasty to each other in 1861 as they are in 2021. Political divides, regional divides, state loyalties, you name it. They would find ways to snip and bite and argue with each other. And you can go back to the election of Jefferson and Adams to see some of the horrible things they would say about each other in their supporting presses. And so the fact that we've got sort of an ongoing fight here between two newspaper editors from New York over how one of them reported on a conference in Malta is, to me, fantastic. Like, that's great. And just a reminder that this kind of thing was always going on. There was never a point in time when the press was this thing that only reported facts and truth. Of course this is editorialized. Of course this has a particular political spin on it. That's why we look at it. That's why we have to analyze it and not just take it for fact. Because they're not trying to report the facts. Well, that's not fair. Let me say it this way. They're not trying to be just the facts. They have a perspective that they're advocating, like any publication. They have a position and they want to make it known. Thayer's not pulling his punches when he writes his weekly column. And I don't think it takes a great amount of detective work to figure out that he's pretty anti-Lincoln in his sentiments. And that's what makes this great. I love this paper for that. It's neat to see a pro-Union, anti-Lincoln perspective. That's why I wanted to do this project. So some really neat stuff here in the August 1st issue. And I am very interested to see what new things they come up with. So there is another issue for next week. That would be the August 8th issue. I hope that if you are enjoying this, that you will give a follow here on Twitch, or if you head on over to YouTube where I post these with full transcripts, give a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I upload the next one. Once again, my name is Dr. Riley. This is the Civil War on Paper, and I hope to see you next week. Have a great night.